Hi there, and welcome to All Things Considered. This is our second episode. And All Things Considered is effectively a South African podcast that seeks to connect you to the research of young African scholars working on African life. So I'm sure that some of you have gotten into an Uber at some point. I know our guest today has just taken an Uber to be here. And, we engage with Ubers quite differently in terms of, maybe sometimes we're quite quiet when we get into an Uber. We don't really want to talk. Sometimes you're quite brave and you want to sit in the front and probably listen to the life stories of the Uber driver. But, sometimes I wonder how many of us have considered the person that is sitting in the driving seat. And today they are going to be the subject of our discussion. So I'm joined today by Celine Masheleni, who is completing a PhD in sociology at the University of Cape Town. And Celine, I've known Celine for a long time. Celine is an Afropolitan. She'll touch on why that is important and what that means for her. But also, Celine is working on African migrants and their intersection with the digital economy, pretty much. So we will be having a fruitful discussion on what it's like to be an African migrant worker in South Africa working on digital work platforms and the kind of vulnerabilities, the exploitation that they might face, and generally how they resist a world or a country or an environment or an economy that is antithetical to their being, if that makes sense, right? So welcome,
Thank
Celine.
you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and how are you today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great.
Lovely.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. I called you an Afropolitan. I've known you for almost 10, 11 years now, right? So can you tell people what that means when someone calls you an Afropolitan?
An Afropolitan.
Mm,
I think to me, it really is the best descriptor of what my lived reality and experience has been.
yeah.
I'll introduce myself again. My name is Celine Masheleni. I am from Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
That's where I was born. But I grew up pretty much my entire life. So that's about 17 years when we moved to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Mm,
And that's where I spent the majority of my childhood. That's where I grew up. My experience in Addis Ababa was informed by my father's occupation at the African Union.
yeah.
And as a result, I've had very close relations, friendships, family friendships with people from all over the continent.
Mm,
Nigeria, Malawi, Rwanda, you name it.
yeah.
These are cultures that I grew up in
Mm,
addition to being in Ethiopia. And then I moved to South Africa in 2015 to pursue my studies. And that also gave me an additional layer of being an Afropolitan.
Yeah.
Yeah, living in South Africa, meeting South Africans, working with people from here, and also people from other places in the continent that's been here.
Yeah.
And I think it informs my perspective in a transformational way, really. I think I see the continent fully for what it is.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to kind of adopt that identity.
I think you are one of the few people I know who has really seen this continent.
Right.
And I think the kind of the relationships rather that you build throughout the continent, of course, as you're saying, will give you a very unique perspective on even things like, our hold on nationalism and wanting to kind of, enforce these kind of colonial barriers and boundaries. And the fact that all these things mean very little.
No, you start seeing the cracks. You start seeing the cracks, even things like languages. I feel like there's instances where you mentioned when you get into an Uber and you realize that this person may not be from South African, they may be from somewhere, and you can think back and remember how to greet them in their own language. So if it's a driver from Ethiopia, I'll often start with salam no.
Yeah.
If it's someone from Malawi, Muriwanje, I've picked up on the ways that we intersect in our languages, in our cultures, in our histories. And I think, Uber was a great space for me to use that and explore, because you start seeing the cracks and the overlaps and how you can come in and try to sort of fill in those gaps.
That's true.
Yeah.
So I think we touched a little bit on the fact that you work on, I guess, your research centers Uber drivers. And I want us to get our audience into that kind of research a little bit by first starting to get an understanding of what drove you to have an interest in the study of migrant workers as they participate in the platform economy.
I think I had two interests, right? So one of the interests I had was technology. And then the other interest I had was around migrants and migrant labor, more specifically. And I kind of wanted to bridge these two interests in together when I came upon something a bit interesting or curious, which is the sort of borderless construction of the world that technologies curate or require. You know, when you're scrolling on the internet, you are seeing content from everywhere, right? You don't even need to be in those places in order to adopt some of their fluencies, right? But it goes beyond content. It's also about the way that we work is starting to exist on this almost borderless plane, right? And that drew me to the platform economy first, the platforms where you have companies that are headquartered in the United States of America that are facilitating livelihoods and people that are living in South Africa. Similarly, with companies that are operating out of European countries, affecting workers that are living in the Philippines. But at the same time, the contention for me was that the other interests that I had, migrants, were very closed in. Their realities were very broadened and very boxed in. And so there seemed to be a tension there for me that I sought to explore, which is, why is there this boundless access to the world that technology and capitalism get to experience off of the backs of people whose lived realities are extremely restricted? And that's kind of how I merged those two interests together to start building upon my research, which sees the migrant as a symbol of what exists, of how a human being exists in the social construction of the world that we've curated today, which is ran by capital and imperialism, right? And so I think migrants represent our condition, our subjectivities, as oppressed people, whether it's race or gender. You can really start to see it.
The subjectivity of an individual who is probably at the most vulnerable state in terms of their relationship with capital, their relationship with neoliberalism,
right?
As we're going to get into, of course. But I think it's quite important for us to get a sense of what the participation of the migrant in the platform economy looks like. So I want us to touch on some numbers, right? And I think in a way, you know, these numbers to some might be quite shocking. And I think maybe that's something worth discussing. And I think a lot of the time people might want to use these numbers that we're going to discuss as a form of confirmation bias. And I want to put it there just to kind of pause it, because we are going to get an understanding of why these numbers look the way they do, right? So you have read some other kind of work that's been done elsewhere around, you know, the platform economy and the migrant participation. And I saw that you referenced Sweep South, which is quite huge, right? You reference, of course, Uber. You reference HSRC data on, like, you know, how many of the platform economy workers are migrants. So do you want to touch on some of those, maybe
Sure.
as an indication?
All right. I think, first of all, globally, we see that the majority of platform workers tend to be people that come from vulnerable or precarious backgrounds. And that definitely tends to include migrants, right? And so they form the majority often of the workforce, particularly in urban cities. In South Africa specifically, it's no different. When you look at Sweep South, which is an application for on-demand domestic work, in a report from 2022, 55.54 of domestic workers were Zimbabwean.
So one nationality.
55%, yes, were one nationality, not just foreign nationals. They were from Zimbabwe. 55%. 40% were South African, right? And so that leaves the rest of that to also come from other countries.
Most likely African countries. Yes.
Yeah, 100%, right? And so the majority of workers on Sweep South are foreign nationals. When you look at Uber drivers, specifically the delivery drivers, there's an estimate that 70% of the country's delivery drivers are foreign nationals. And that number is currently at 6,400 people. But I have an instinct that tells me that it's much more than that. And then when you look at Uber, specifically the transport component of Uber, in the Western Cape, 85%.
That's quite a high number.
Of Uber drivers are foreign nationals, right? There are reports that say there may be around 20,000 Uber drivers in South Africa nationally. And the majority of those, which is actually pegged around 90% in the 90s, are foreign nationals, right? But either way, the pattern that comes up to me across all of the statistics and all the measurements that have been attempted to capture this workforce is that a lot of them tend to be migrants, right? And so the question is why?
The question is why, right?
The question is why.
And I think as I put a precursor to these numbers, quite importantly, because I know that these numbers can be exploited for certain type of narratives, right? And we know that, of course, in the kind of an Afrophobic environment, the anti-immigration kind of environment that we find ourselves in, of course, there will be some individuals who will say 90% of Uber drivers are blah, 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 right? And then that is often co-opted to, justify forms of, exclusion, wanting them out of the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that what your research does, which is quite interesting for me, is that it contextualizes the numbers for us, right? It contextualizes why it is that Uber work, for example, platform work, would be probably the most attractive out of other forms of kind of worse conditions of work, right, for the migrant. Right. So I think there's something to be said about why it is that we do find migrants choosing this form of work in its in numbers. So I think let's touch on why you think what are the reasons you think this line of work is quite attractive. And I want to ask this question in relation to other forms of work that African migrants, as they come into the country, are more likely to do, right? So in that context, what makes platform work so attractive for the migrant worker?
Okay, so I'll answer that question twofold. First off, I think what my research is urging me to come to the conclusion that by design, platform companies seek out the most vulnerable of workers, right? Particularly on-demand platform companies that require service fast and efficiently. In order for a company to provide you with the fast and efficient service, which is the promise that they make, they need a surplus of workers available to take up that particular certain work, right? So if you order an Uber, Uber needs you to have a driver 2 minutes out, right? And so the way that they access this pool of workers is by depressing the criterion that's needed to enter this line of work, right? So they don't ask for too much. They don't ask for too much documentation, too much regulation. They make their entry standards very, very low. It's a very easily accessible form of work. And that's by design, because what it does is it allows them to have this reserve army of labor that can be mobilized at any instant, right? And so that is intentional for their business model. They exploit that vulnerability, but also it shows why then migrants are more likely to opt for that kind of work. And so when you are vulnerable, you don't have your documentation, perhaps, or there is a language barrier, or there is you just arrived and you don't know anyone, right? You are attracted to this low barrier form of work, easily accessible form of work, right? And so that's kind of where that initial attraction comes from. But then you also look again at the subjectivity of the migrant worker, the condition of the migrant worker. Perhaps they have tried, and many of them have worked previously in restaurants, in farms, in other companies. And what they find is that their vulnerability continues to follow them everywhere, right? And so, for instance, workers speak about exploitation within the workplace, in restaurants or in farms, where their condition as a migrant is often weaponized against them.
Let's touch on that a little bit more, right? Because we know if you live in Cape Town, for example, you know that pretty much most restaurants employ a significant amount of foreign workers, I want to say. And what are these in what ways is their status as a most likely undocumented worker? How is that
well,
exploited?
there's a number of ways that it happens. From my research and from the interviews that I've taken up, you hear of overworking, working extensive hours, obviously underpaying, lack of social welfare, social protection, lack of a voice, lack of options. And so the condition of a migrant is, I'm here, I'm earning a little bit of money, let me stay here. And many of their employers know that this is their condition, right? And even though it might not be an overt type of exploitation, you know, one where someone is clearly taking advantage of another person, the systems still enable that kind of reciprocity, I suppose, where you give me a little bit that I can survive and I'll do the work however you need it to be done, right? And so it pushes the migrant workers into a certain condition, which a lot of them who end up on Uber speak about how it becomes too much at some point.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because I think, you know, these kind of jobs that maybe they decide to leave in order to embark on like a, you know, a new journey of being an e-hailing driver are kind of jobs that I think make so much more apparent the kind of projected ill dignity of the migrant worker, right? And I say this because I mean, you're speaking about how, you know, in the what's this the restaurant space, they seem to be treated quite badly. They're not treated as persons in a lot of ways, right? It's like you're here to do your job, but in some ways you're here to do the job on my terms. And we know the kind of treatment that they kind of experience.
It creates a power imbalance.
Yeah.
Right.
A general power imbalance. And I think, you know, I wanted to also bring another kind of side to things where, you know, in the case where a migrant doesn't necessarily work for someone, but tries to kind of, you know, find work on their own, I know that like they also face significant challenges.
Right.
And there's also kind of those kind of aesthetics and realities of ill dignity involved in that as well. I mean, I live quite close to a garage, as I was telling you earlier, where a petrol station, maybe people don't know what a garage is, but I live close to a petrol station, and pretty much every morning on the clock as I drive to work, they are kind of countless amounts of undocumented workers effectively raising their hand like this, coming to your car, just being desperate for one job for the day. And they are pretty much completely at the mercy of the individual who ends up giving them a job, right? And they work for whatever they can get. It's almost like the power is completely in your hands. But there's something quite in those kind of optics of someone coming to run into your car with multiple of them kind of surrounding your car, hoping that you will choose them today, get a job. I feel like there's a certain kind of optic of just a level of, I guess, a desperation. But I think also reflects the extent of the vulnerability and the ill dignity of being an unprotected worker.
Right.
And I think the lived reality of trying to make it work in a very difficult and I think, demoralizing situation.
Right.
So I think in those kind of ways, we can maybe start seeing how it is that, yes, the platform environment, as we're going to discuss, has its own sets of challenges, vulnerabilities, forms of exploitation. But there's also a reason why a lot of them leave
and end up there.
Yeah.
And I think I just wanted to point out what you said about the condition of being an unprotected worker. I think it also, that's what I was referring to earlier when I said migrants are kind of a symbol of what it's like to have the subjectivity of oppression in the world today. Because that is the condition of precariousness generally, of informal workers and precarious workers anywhere. The key distinction to make here is that their precarity is largely anchored on their identity as migrants, right? But that those optics of ill dignity are what exists for precarious workers. And the part that I think is interesting is the fact that the majority of the world's workers today are in some level of precarity, right? As neoliberalism and privatization shrinks our access to dignified work and to formal work, and thus formal livelihoods. More of us fall into these categories of precariousness, which platform companies seem to have capitalized on and done so
clearly very well.
Very well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, that, it's quite important to realize that it is an exploitation of an identity. It kind of creates an additional layer of precarity in some way or another. And I think also it's important not to obviously see these two, like the precarity of a South African worker, for example, as mutually exclusive from the precarity of the migrant, right? It's almost like, oh, when we talk about the precarity of the migrant, all of a sudden people tend to think that we are undermining the condition of being a South African worker.
Right.
But we can have both conversations at the same time, and we must. Yeah. And we're going to touch on that, of course, right? With why
when
it's
we speak of solidarity.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess we get a sense of, you've just given us a sense of what effectively drives the driver to the driving seat.
Right.
When I say, right? And I think that I think this gives us a way to come into understanding what life is like as a Uber driver, Bolt driver. Let's not just center Uber. We're just using Uber also mainly as a
it becomes
linguistic thing,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily that we're speaking about the company, so please don't sue us. But it has much more to do. It's like a linguistic thing where we tend to call them
about these platform companies, these on-demand companies, and so being an e-hailing driver comes with a multitude of challenges that e-hailing drivers experience across the board, as well as the challenges that migrant e-hailing drivers also experience, right? So I'll start with the challenges of being an e-hailing driver generally. You experience lack of income stability. You don't know how much you're going to make at any given day or week.
Any day is a new day.
Every day is a new day, right? And so there is a lot of, and I think one of the major concerns of e-hailing drivers is the instability of their income. And that pushes them often into overworking, right? And back when these companies were starting out, they sort of gamified that instability a little bit, and they would offer incentives to say, well, if you worked more than this many hours a day, then you would get extra money. Or if you carried these many clients, then you would get extra money. And so what this did, and we saw examples of this in China particularly, was this gamified strategy of increasing the working hours, ended up creating a situation where drivers were falling asleep at the wheel. Drivers were going days working, overworking, sleeping in their cars.
And that's something maybe, brings perspective, and otherwise maybe, a joke that people tend to make would be like, oh, this car smells like, someone has been like in here for a long time. It's so stuffy.
Right.
You have to understand that some things have they have a reason.
They have a reason.
Right. So the fact that you walk into a stuffy car and you feel like, oh my gosh, let me open the windows, is mainly in part because that individual feels so kind of compelled to overwork themselves in order to secure an income.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it I mean, you can order a car at any time of the day. It doesn't matter if it's 3 a.m. In the morning, right? And so you think about how people that are existing in these surplus environments are working. Their day-to-day livelihoods, their day-to-day routines are completely disrupted, and they're focused on generating enough income to cover their costs, which are extensive, by the way, and may even include paying off the car that they are renting in order to operate on the platform.
So there's the rental of the car, there's fuel.
There's fuel, there's servicing, there's maintenance, there is data for the phone.
And all those costs fall on them.
On the driver.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
And I think the misconception is that it's the car owners that take on these costs.
No.
But actually it's the driver.
No, it typically is the driver, particularly things like data, things like fuel. They give them the car and they tell them, give me back my 2,500 Rand at the end of the week. And that's their relationship.
Oh my gosh.
Right.
So they're not even just drivers, effectively. They're also project managers.
Yes.
They are logistical managers.
There is so much effective labor that comes with being a driver. You're also managing the client. It's customer relations.
And you still have to be pleasant.
And you have to be
pleasant. You have to be pleasant so that...
and not a scary big Black man, as some of them are seen and perceived as, right? Like you say, those optics of ill dignity that follow the marginalized communities. Yeah. So income stability is definitely a big challenge, and it plays out into all these other components as well. There's also the challenge of safety. And this is particularly key in South Africa, where, of course, we all deal with the remnants of what spatial apartheid is and how it organizes or distributes crime in the city. What that means is that the drivers that are on the roads are more exposed and vulnerable to crime. Hijackings, robberies, I've heard of cars being torched on fire. Sometimes, when they receive a trip and the trip takes them to somewhere where they get there and then they get hijacked, robbed, beaten, gunpoint. It's an excessive amount of violence that these men experience, men and women experience. Typically, we find that most of them are men. Then there's the health challenges of sitting and driving 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
Right? And the impact that has on your body, on your psyche, the mental challenges that come with that kind of work are also unaccounted for. Yeah. Oftentimes unaccounted for. There is then the administrative challenges that people face. For instance, here in the city of Cape Town, the issue of car impounding has been a big challenge that many drivers have reported back on, where they're required to have a permit in order to operate as e-hailing drivers, but their reality is that those permits aren't being made available. But livelihoods don't stop. People still need to work in order to account for their costs, right? And so it's now a game of cat and mouse, where there's an additional barrier or an additional challenge in the traffic officers that can impound their vehicles, and then they have to pay large sums of money in order to get their cars back.
I think let's pause on that, because you spoke quite a bit about, obviously, the vulnerabilities that they face. And in a lot of ways, I think those vulnerabilities are as a result of the kind of space that they work in, right? Because typically, if you work in an office setting, your employer has some kind of interest in making sure that your well-being is taken care of, right? Making sure that everyone get up, go get some coffee, take a walk or something, go get a smoke, whatever, to clear your mind, right? There's also like other forms of protection, right? You make sure that when you get into a building, there's always security at the front door. There's some biometrics, those kind of things. So what do you think happens when someone works on a digital platform like this? Or maybe more so in terms of how their status as not an employee, right? As it's something that you touch on quite a bit. Their status as not being an employee kind of is in one way a contributing factor to all these issues.
And it's by design, right? So what platform companies also tend to exploit is this concept or idea, false idea of choice, right? The response typically when you mention that there is lack of social protection, there is no regulation, employees or workers aren't being taken care of, well, they say it's a choice to join our platform.
You can choose to be unprotected.
That's right.
But it's
and
up
if
to
you don't like it,
then get off. Yeah.
It's a bind, honestly, right? And it's a false sense of choice. And in sociology, we speak about this as well, about how the ruling class creates this perception of choice as if it exists, right? And you see it even in the marketing material that is used to recruit.
Of e-hailing services. That's right. Yeah.
That is used to recruit drivers, the language that they use. Make money on your own time. Be your own boss.
Autonomy. We sell in your autonomy.
Yeah. Exactly. And these things are designed to remove that element of to make it seem as though there is an element of choice when there actually is not. Right. And so it also kind of blurs that line, and blurs the reality. And then the sad part is a lot of drivers that I spoke to also seem to have maybe internalized that is the case. You know, they understand that these companies are private companies and thus they'll do what they need to do for their business. And it removes their voice as well. They don't have any ways to voice out their concerns about their vulnerabilities. Yeah.
You just have to kind of adjust accordingly. If the capitalist master says do something, not changing things.
There's like stories I've heard where like during strikes where MOUs, memorandums are drafted with demands for what the workers need in order to perform their job well. And the following day, they'll get a notification that says, accept the terms and agreements of using our platform, right? Nobody reads those terms and agreements.
I should say I never read the terms and conditions.
But what they do is that they just implement clauses that agree against their own MOUs the next day after a strike. So if we're unhappy about this, tomorrow you'll see it in the terms of agreements.
They have no bargaining power either.
Zero.
So it's almost like you're not an employee. You have no bargaining power. You are only kind of positioned as someone who is autonomously using our platform and takes the risks that come with that.
Yeah.
And of course, that kind of means that, you know, we are going to, as e-hailing platforms, the intention is to make a profit over your vulnerabilities and also ignore them. Have the opportunity, the platform, the ability to ignore them, which is why it's important not to count them as employees for these e-hailing services, right?
You're actually a customer.
You are a customer just as much as the rider.
As the rider is, because also they take commissions, right? So off of your earning potential, they skank off a little bit. And it's not even a little bit. A lot of the drivers are complaining at the moment that those commissions are too high.
It's just spending too much
And there's
money.
a lot of lack of transparency around what the commissions are, because they might say we're only going to take 20%. But you find that when you tell your driver how much you're paying for your ride versus what they're being told is being paid for the ride, there's a huge disparity.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember like the Uber drivers complaining that almost at some point someone was saying that they take about 30%.
More than that.
Even more.
Yeah.
And the fact that sometimes they don't only take the 30%, but also they kind of, there was an issue with like what routes are made available to you. Kind of trips, the long trips that are made available to people.
And the fees that they don't necessarily always explain. I've seen receipts that look different and they all have different fees. And some of those fees are never clear as to, you know, why am I being charged this particular fee or levy or so on. But so the commission might look like it's okay, only 30%, only 20%. But when you account for all of those extra fees, then you find that it's way more that they take.
In a lot of ways, I think that we obviously can't attend to this topic of African migrants working on the platform economy without attending to the broader political kind of milieu, right, which has much more to do with the fact that these migrant workers are working in a space that is heavily anti their presence, right? We're living in an anti-immigration society at the moment, a very Afrophobic society, right? And for those who don't know, maybe listeners who are not from South Africa, right? We have a couple of movements, so to speak. Like we have the Operation Dudula movement, we have the Put South Africa First movement, right? Which are kind of proudly xenophobic movements in one way or another, right? And a lot of the time they are premised on wanting to remove migrant workers, remove quote unquote illegal workers or illegal migrants from the country. And the idea behind that is that that's somehow going to improve the conditions of the South Africans left, you know. So I think there's going to be something important that we need to touch on those and we need to touch on that maybe and try and, you know, counter those narratives in one way or another, centering the migrant worker. But there's other things, I think, and a lot of things that people don't know is that a lot of these sentiments are also based on certain kind of beliefs and some, what you say, conspiracy theories, right? So one of the most dominant conspiracy theories is the modern slavery replacement theory, so to speak, right? In this kind of idea that migrant workers are making themselves available to exploitation. And the idea is that they are exploiting their exploitation in a way such that they want to, you know, they eventually want to take over the country, right? So they kind of using their exploitation as a means of taking over the rest of South Africa. So that's one thing. But also this kind of modern slavery conspiracy theory takes other forms, including the fact that, well, what we're doing is also what we're doing as someone who is labeled as xenophobic. Let's just say, because that's what they would say, right? Someone who's labeled as xenophobic, what we're actually doing is that we're protecting these workers from being modern slaves by wanting them to not participate in the economy. So I think there's a lot of mental gymnastics that tends to happen, right, in order to justify extricating these workers from the economy, right? And this idea that having these workers gone is not just going to be good for us as South Africans, right? But it's also going to be good for them, and obviously grounded in these kind of narratives. So I guess my question is, how do we contextualize what is actually happening, right? In terms of the migrant experience, their participation in the economy. Is there any merit? And obviously I don't think so. But what could we see in the experience of the migrant worker that counters these narratives and conspiracies?
I think what's important, and not to, you know, bring it back to reality type thing, because of, like you said, this is a conspiracy, right? But theoretically, when you understand the theory, right, behind neoliberalism and behind the accumulation of profit, is you understand that the function of a capitalist enterprise, of a corporation, of a business, is to make money, right? And businesses make money by one or two ways. They either raise their prices of the services that they're offering, or they cut their costs, right? And typically how businesses cut costs is cutting labor, right?
First thing they cut.
That's the first thing they cut most of the time, right? And so any opportunity to exploit the labor reserve that they can access, any opportunity to cut that cost in order to drive their profit accumulation, a business will take, right?
Right.
And so, yes, there may be legally regulations that say you have to employ a worker that is understood as South African because they were born here and they have citizenship and ties to this land. If that can be bypassed for more profit and less costs, I'd imagine that, you know, it will be bypassed. And so already for me, it seems as though the problem is coming from the side of capital rather than it does from the person that is at the receiving end of this exploitation, right? And so that's where I think you often see a lot of the arguments that we make is that you should be focusing on capital, right, instead of the workers.
I think that, and that's quite important, because there is always going to be another vulnerable group that can be exploited, right? There are also undocumented South Africans, for example, who are also already experiencing very similar experiences to the migrants, right?
And it's not just about undocumented South Africans, it's also our identities that make us precarious, right? So sometimes it's gender.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And sometimes you find that if it is a gendered vulnerability that can be exploited, and capitalism is not shy about exploiting.
Trust.
Right? So I think that's the first point that I make to that kind of contention that exists. And also, I think also theoretically, it's important to understand that this is exactly how the system is designed to work, right? It's designed to sow divisions, create competitiveness amongst the precariat class, whether one is migrant or one is local. It creates this false sense of division so that you can keep fragmented. And when you are a fragmented class, you don't have collective agency. You can't bargain with capital, right? So I think that's the first point that needs to be understood.
I think even a lot of the times you think that, capital typically distributes the kind of crumbs of the bread, so to speak, right? And effectively wants the masses to fight amongst themselves for a share of the crumbs.
Exactly.
And the point with that kind of like analogy is to say that the bread is still in the hand.
It's still over there.
It's still over there. That's actually what you want.
Right.
You want a decent slice of the bread.
Right. Because there's no moral justification that entire large chunk of wealth can be held by one individual or a marginal amount of people. Right? Particularly when the reality is that lives are at stake. People need to eat today.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of a reframing of the problem is always important. It's the first thing that you have to do.
Because I think in a lot of ways, the precarity is also sometimes justified as a way to, target and scapegoat the migrant, right?
Right.
They were saying things like, yeah, we know, well, these people are desperate anyway. They don't have jobs anyway. So it's like, yeah, we can understand why they want to kind of remove the migrant. But I think what we're pointing towards here is maybe that precarity is kind of going to continuously reproduce itself because it's not really dealing with the problem at hand.
No.
You are always going to be a vulnerable worker insofar as you engage in practices of capital. You engage in the way that the capitalist requires you to engage in this hyper competitive way, right? In this way that is also highly individualistic, right? And in grouping kind of practices, right? That it's going to be impossible to sow the kind of collective agency, the solidarity that is required.
It's about the organization of society, right? Which pieces are where is inconsequential to how capitalism functions, right? Whether it is a migrant, whether it is a woman, whether it is queer people, whoever is easily exploitable is going to be exploited. But also, I think it points to how this is, again, by design, right? And so you look at what are some of the designers of this system. You have capital, but also you have state, right? The way that we conceptualize statehood, the way that we conceptualize nationhood is a social construct. Let's start with that one, right? You know about the Berlin Conference, where not a single African was present, and yet our continent was chopped up. Families were broken apart. Cultures were chopped up. And it created these lines that we so vehemently defend to this day, right? And you defend them through nationalism, through this rhetoric, put South Africa first. The phrase itself doesn't really make sense. First in relation to what? First where? Right?
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
And so these kind of like nationalist upticking, they sound good. They sound nice, right? We have shared history and shared culture with our fellow countrymen. but they're also weaponized, right? And you also see that they are politicians, they are demagogues that mobilize the type of frustration and the type of anger that comes out of people for these nationalist tendencies, right? For state building, right? The implication that South Africa should be first, it necessitates that someone else should be second and someone else should be lost. And so what is being advocated for here is the right to be an imperial top.
To kind of replicate the imperial structures.
The imperial structure.
I'm not at the top somewhere, but at least I can be at the top here.
Right.
And just kind of replicate the very logics that are oppressive of you.
Right.
Yeah.
And at risk of kind of going into the realm of what others critique as anarchy, for me, it's also about looking at the structures that are justified as necessary for state building, for instance, migration laws, right? And they are built to create borders and to support the borders, right? And they don't often match the natural movement of people on the continent. And so when you look at South Africa's migration regime and how it's been built, I mean, it was interesting when it was being written down, there's references about relating it to countries in Europe before they look at countries next door and within their own cultural sort of stratosphere.
Yeah.
And so you have to also look at how statehood and its preservation is also a factor in reproducing the vulnerabilities that migrants experience, which then capitalism exploits. Right. And so this construction of statehood, our understanding of the nation, right, and our protection of it through the criteria that's set for migration is the anchor point at which capitalism operates its exploitation. That's the control board right there, right? Because if it says that you need this type of work permit in order to work in South Africa, and in order to get that work permit, you need this amount of money, right? If I'm desperate enough to come across a border in order to work somewhere, do I have that type of money that's needed to access that permit? No. So already the state has sanctioned the vulnerability of this person, right? And that is that key operative that capitalism looks at and says, as long as this is going to keep reproducing vulnerability, we have people to exploit.
Exactly.
And people will continue to come through. I mean, there's the example of the America-Mexico border. The richest, most militant country in the world is not able to secure its border.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we think that we can do it, that we can close.
Yeah. But, and I think that maybe to point to something else, which is quite interesting, is that a lot of the time, right, these movements that we just spoke about as well, kind of approach things from the air of the inevitability of capital, the inevitability of statehood, right? That almost in some ways, just because the capitalist is always going to be a capitalist and there's nothing we can do about it, that's kind of also a justification that they use typically to direct their attention to the vulnerable groups and extricating those vulnerable groups, right? And I think in a lot of ways as well, the kind of the essentialization of nationhood, right, as something that can't also change, can't also be, reconceptualized. Why is it that nationhood can't make sense of multiculturalism, can't make sense of Pan-Africanism? Why is that an inherent impossibility? Those are the kind of questions that I really grapple with, right? But in a lot of ways, I think that this sentiment of the inevitability of capitalism and the fact that capitalists are always going to be capitalists is kind of really is the very thing that feeds into the vulnerabilities of all groups, right? That ultimately, if you position yourself as a figure that's always going to be powerless and try to garner power elsewhere, right? Aside from kind of that garnering the power where it really matters, someone has the people who really have these sentiments really have to think critically about what is really going to save them from their precarity, from the vulnerability. And we can somewhat bet our top bottom rand so that, getting rid of a migrant who is also just trying to make it work just as much as you are in this kind of superstructure of capitalism is not really going to work well for you, you know. So I think that there's a question about where we choose to direct our angers, right? And where it's most productive to direct your anger,
Right.
you know. And I think that in a lot of ways, as we already discussed, of course, the directing of anger to someone who in a lot of ways is as precarious as you in the face of capitalism is really not going to solve much, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it requires a radical approach, right? And that can be destabilizing because it sheds away all of the identity markers that you've been told you have and that you believe you're entitled to, right? And so the notion of solidarity comes to mind here. And we have to define what exactly we mean by solidarity. And then we have to decide to be 100% in, right? If we are saying here that all of our problems, all of the issues that we face are as a reproduction of neoliberalism, then we have to approach our response as an attack on neoliberalism itself, right? And when you look at capital and neoliberalism, they have unbounded access to the world, right? To our bodies. Your radicalism needs to embody that same amount of audacity, in my perspective.
That's true. Yeah.
Right. And so solidarities need to cross over those boundaries. You can't bring radical change insofar as you maintain the hierarchization of society, right? It's like what I'm saying earlier. If we're saying that we're putting South Africa first, it necessitates a second, a third, a last, right? And so you're just going to keep reproducing the same types of struggles and the same types of challenges, right? But when you look at it from a horizontal perspective, right? From an equality perspective, for equity perspective, perhaps even, right? You're positioned much more favorably, in my opinion, to take on the true beast.
The true beast.
The real beast, which is capitalism, right? Which is this idea that society is stratified and resources are distributed on this sort of linear stratified model, right? Capitalism necessitates someone at the bottom. And being at the bottom creates precariousness. And precarity is dangerous, right? And so that's kind of how I would sort of think about that. I don't, it's not necessarily about the inevitability of capital, just as much as it is about the how radical our response is going to be.
Needs to be, yeah.
Needs to be.
Yeah.
It's a complete deconstruction of what you're told to believe.
That's
and what your aspirations may be as an individual versus as a collective, as a community.
Yeah. You know, precarity is quite dangerous. And I want to close us off by really understanding, you know, the practices of resistance and resilience in the face of precarity, especially, again, recentering the people that brought us here today, right? These e-hailing drivers, African migrant e-hailing drivers. So in what ways do they attempt to kind of respond to their vulnerability, precarity, exposure to exploitation?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is where it's really interesting for me, because that's when you start to see pockets of such radicalism, right? And it's a concept that I'm playing around by calling placemaking. And I'm defining that as the will and the ability to continue anyways. Right.
Just carry on.
Just keep going.
What's that? It's giving me that meme with the crown on it or something. Remember?
Which one?
Something.
Keep calm and carry on.
Oh, yeah.
Keep calm and carry on. Yeah. I mean, essentially, that's what it is, right? And the interesting thing is that people find ways to build systems that still support their livelihoods, right? And so if it's a thing about finances, about managing their financials, and perhaps they don't have access to banks, they'll find a way to have access to banking. If it's a thing of social welfare or social protection, what we see is that a lot of migrants collectivize, right? They use their cultural knowledge and where they come from to build communities, intentional communities that support each other. They buy cars for each other. They do business together because there's a shared understanding. That solidarity, again, creates the shared understanding of a shared struggle. And so they organize based off of that. There are so many different ways, right? Whether it's education, language. Sometimes when a migrant lands or arrives in South Africa, whether by bus or by air, they may not know who's waiting for them on the other side, but they know that, my brother knows this person who connected me to this person. And that trust bond is carrying a lot of people through. I'll give an example.
Yeah, please.
I interviewed a driver, fascinating story, who said that it cost him a SIM card to cross the border from Zimbabwe to South Africa about 20 years ago or something.
And how, yeah.
A SIM card.
That's insane.
That's what he offered the truck driver, who was local, by the way. A SIM card, and it got him over the border.
And from where? Where
from
was it coming
Zimbabwe
from? To
South Africa. So he arrived in Messina.
Yeah.
He gave the truck driver a SIM card, crossed the border, and then you have to find your way. Once you're in the place, you can walk around, you blend in. And so he got himself to Pretoria afterwards, where he caught a train. Caught this train to Cape Town. And he knew no one in Cape Town. He had no accommodation in Cape Town. He had no plans. He just knew that he wanted to go to a place called Cape Town. That's what he had seen, right? So whilst he's on the train, he starts listening and he hears people that are speaking his language. They were speaking in Shona. And he decides to greet them, right? And they have a conversation. Oh, where are you coming from? I'm coming from here. And then they realize that they each have a problem that the other can solve.
Oh, I see.
So the first guy, the one who came with a SIM card, had the challenge that he didn't have a place to stay. And the guy who he was speaking to had the challenge that he had a place to stay, but he didn't have money to get to where he needed to get to. And so they came to an agreement. If I pay for the tickets, can I stay with you? Yeah, of course. And they lived together for months, right? And they would do what you spoke about earlier, where they would go stand by the robots and advertise to try to get work. And eventually he upskilled himself. He started doing window aluminum framing. Yeah. And then afterwards, that's when he started buying and selling cars with the money that he had saved up from doing his window working. He bought his first car. It was like a broken little thing that couldn't get anywhere. He managed to sell it, make a profit off of that, and bought a second car. And then Uber came into South Africa at the time, and that was an easy out for him. He already had the vehicle, so he joined Uber, managed his finances, sleeping in a shack, doing all of the things that he needed to do until today, where he owns 4 cars that he rents out and earns a pretty stable income from that as well.
Wow, yeah.
And so he was abandoned essentially by his own state, by the financial crisis that was happening in Zimbabwe at the time, as well as here by his status as an illegal person, as illegible to the system. And yet he found a way to make it anyway, right? And that's resistance in some ways.
He engaged in placemaking.
He placemade, exactly.
Yeah. Which is so fascinating because for me, your concept of placemaking is really kind of how it's in some way a response to a kind of structural condition that is antithetical to place, right? Antithetical to you being there.
In place.
Right. Being there, being safe, and all these kind of things that we associate with place. Stability, is that if you exist in an environment that is inherently, kind of designed to make you precarious, not just in terms of the labor sense, but just to kind of introduce levels of instability in all forms of your life, right? As you're saying, like, how do you bury your loved ones?
Right.
When you you're undocumented, all these kind of things. And I think it's quite important that, part of the, I know people in development studies hate this word resilience, for example, because it's quite loaded as well. But there's something to be said about how human beings they're resisting by creating forms of stability for themselves.
Right. And you're a philosopher, so maybe you can also think about how our relation to place, to space, to the ground is constructed completely. Like at our core, we are just bodies on a planet. Right? Yeah. And it takes you to this place where you realize that, okay, that is the place where someone is at when they realize that they need to survive. They need to remain alive. And so they build structures that may not be what is socially acceptable or what is, widely used, but it helps them to survive.
It works for them and it helps them live another day.
Live another day.
Which in a lot of ways, that's kind of, what we're all doing.
As human beings.
Yeah. I think this was a fantastic conversation. And I'm so happy to see the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of concepts that you bring about. And I guess, with our previous guest, Nabil, we have you, Celine, who's really interested in, articulating the lives of the most vulnerable in a lot of ways on this continent. And I think that I want this podcast to be able to give us insight into those kind of lived experiences. In a way, it's a form of phenomenology of sort of African life. You know what I mean?
Right.
What is it to be African?
Right.
We need to understand it from all kinds of directions, right? And right now we know what it's like, at least a little bit of an insight into what it's like to be an African worker on these digital platforms in a quote unquote different African country like South Africa.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So thank you for joining me, Celine.
Thank you for having me. This was a fantastic conversation.
We had a great Thanks, my friend.
Thank you.